Welcome to Cyber Focus from the McCrary Institute, where we explore the people and ideas that shape and protect our digital world. Thrilled to welcome Chris Krebs today, a longtime friend and colleague who is known to pretty much everyone in the cyber field, was the first director of CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. We had the privilege of hosting him on campus at Auburn to release their national strategy. And Chris, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Frank. Good to be back after a little bit of a break, I guess, but excited to be back with Auburn.
Well, great, Chris. And I thought we could start with a little bit looking backwards and looking to your role as director of CISA and sort of how that shaped your thinking in terms of where we are as a country, what we need to prioritize and focus on, and where do we go from here? What unfinished business do we need to move on?
Right. Well, as I think about that time, I visited Auburn. It was a really impressive facility, really impressive faculty and students. That was, it was a great time, a great memory. So what's left to do? What I've seen from Jen Easterly and CISA under her leadership, I think what I really have been impressed by is their ability to do what we were doing in my time, and then, turn it to 11. Really, and that's, to play off, Jen's role, fandom. They've really hypercharged the partnerships. They've had a number of different authorities and mandates provided by the Congress, including setting up the JCDC, pulling these partnerships together. She has an advisory board that is helpful to make sure she's getting the right insight, and then some additional authorities, the ability to use administrative subpoenas to get down a little bit further into the stack to see who's hanging vulnerable stuff on the internet that you can discover by Shodan or whatever, but you kind of run into a brick wall at the telecom level.
You were pushing for some of those authorities already, though.
So, well, of course, JCDC is really an output. is an output of your work and others on
yours and others
on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. The advisory board to the CISA director is something that I was evaluating options through 2019 and 20. Did we have existing authorities, or did Congress have to jump in and provide some clarity there that we could have an advisory panel? But after SolarWinds, there was a little nugget tied into, I guess it was the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, that allowed for CISA to go hunt and deploy endpoint detection and response capabilities across the civilian agencies. Again, that was also in Cyberspace Solarium Commission. So, just these, more authorities that they can use to the advantage of the federal government. And the really interesting thing is that as you watch more recent events, the maturity that is taking place within the federal government. So the State Department last summer was the canary in the coal mine for the Chinese exploitation of the Microsoft Cloud mail hack of last summer. I mean this in the best possible light for any State Department viewers or listeners, but they didn't have their act together. It was a massive enterprise in a state that was lacking strategy and coherence across the enterprise.
And I think they've righted some.
They absolutely
fixed role and
post SolarWinds completely turned it around to the point where they had incredibly advanced relative to the federal government, a really advanced approach to detection and response. They had baselined the network. They knew what normal looked like. And when they saw anomalous activity, they dug in. And maybe they couldn't figure it out, but they shared it with Microsoft, and Microsoft was like, we don't know what this is either, investigated further and saw, okay, this isn't right. Something's happening here. And that's exactly how you want it to work. You want these agencies to get better and better and better, but you also want them to have a really good sense of what's happening on their networks. So they're tools that we spend all this money on can be effective.
Useful. Yeah. That's an excellent point. And now that you've left CISA, what more, now that you're in a private sector role, would you like to see the federal government do to support the private sector? Because at the end of the day, what makes CISA unique is its engagement with critical infrastructure owners and operators.
Right.
And at the end of the day, we all know private sector's on the front lines of this war. And all things said and done, there's been mass improvement, but there's still this mindset of government lead, private sector follow to one extent or another. So I'd be curious, just given now that you're out, what would you have told your former self to do or maybe think about a little differently?
I think it gets back to that, really dig in on understanding the gaps in the challenges that industry is having. There are plenty of organizations and businesses out there that don't, frankly, need the government's help. They may have some incremental gaps that they need filled, and that's maybe more on the kind of strategic intelligence perspective, but it's not a tool.
And imposing cost on bad actors.
Of course.
Yeah.
But
yes.
As I was thinking through what my leadership approach was going to be within CISA and how I wanted to really, fit CISA into the landscape, was reading, as much as I could, different strategy approaches. And it was actually Secretary Mattis's book, talked about his own leadership style and that he had modeled after President Washington. And it really stuck with me, and it reflected kind of my thinking as well. But it was listen, learn, help, lead. And it's almost crawl, walk, run. But if you can't lead anything if you haven't really figured out what the problem is, and it really manifested best for CISA within the election security space. And it was when I came in, and I hadn't really anticipated having election security be a big part of the mission when I was considering joining in 2016, 2017. Yep. But I show up in March of 2017, and there's a stack of letters about this tall on the desk to General Kelly, Secretary Kelly, who I was a counselor to, about election security. And a lot of that they were not happy letters. There were lots that were concerned that the federal government was going to take over or federalize elections, which is certainly not the case. But when we met with stakeholders, there was a lot of confusion on their end, and I'm not sure we fully understood what the mission looked like. So there was a lot of listening for the first year or so. And as we listened, we were learning what the opportunities were, what the challenges were, and where there were some gaps, and particularly on cybersecurity education and awareness and tooling, some of the things that might not always be available to counties in every single state. This is not a rural state problem. This is not a New England problem. This is every states have resource constraints, and we had to figure out where the right ones we could plug in and provide some assistance, some help. But there were also going to be opportunities where we needed to lead, where we needed to pull everyone together. And part of that was in establishing the election infrastructure ISAC in 2018. It was leading a series of not full national level exercises in the FEMA context, but national exercises, tabletop the vote, that we held and that continue through to this day. From a private sector perspective, what I say CISA needs to do is continue committing to that style, that approach. Now, there are going to be moments where that leading could conflict or run, it perceived cross purposes with the traditional CISA mission of being the public-private partnership lead. And I think you may...
Well, it's not doing its job if it never has those, or at least doesn't ask those questions.
Right. I mean, there are carrots and sticks here.
Yep.
And at some point, when there aren't any carrots or the carrots aren't good enough, you need to reevaluate, do you have the right carrots? But you also need to say, is there a different method, a more compelling or coercive method? And I think this is where we're starting to see the Congress lean with the cyber incident reporting requirements, the rulemaking that's going on right now under CISA, which is the Cyber Incident Reporting
and
Act.
some of the SEC requirements.
Well, that's of course different. But
interrelated.
There's some, but there's some conflict there as well that I think is worth unpacking a little bit. But the CISA authorities allows them to require reporting for certain events to CISA, and there are penalties associated with that. And there's been some, prior very small regulatory authorities that, of course, are now suspended under the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards. But
is that a big problem for you? CFAT's sort of fallen by the wayside.
I think the program certainly needs to mature at this point. I mean, it was first enacted in 2007, and it's 2024. There have been some improvements over time.
And that was largely the IP side of
that was
NPPD, predecessor to CISA, right?
That was Office of Infrastructure Protection within NPPD, the predecessor organization.
I can't even remember what it stands for.
National Protection and Programs Directorate. I actually did forget that at one event 6 months ago, and I was just shamed.
Shame on you,
I know. But again, you don't. CISA doesn't want to be leading as a regulator. I do think more broadly there is going to be an increased shift in regulation within the government. I don't necessarily think it's going to come out of CISA, but there are market failures all around us, and the Congress will have to act. And I think you should absolutely try the carrots first, and I think that's what you're seeing right now with some of the Secure by Design initiatives that are coming out of CISA and elsewhere, that we really do need to harden and improve the quality of software that industry is putting out there.
I got to put a plug in for cyber-informed engineering, DOE's equivalent of that on the OT side as well. So I don't disagree with you. I'm seeing the ground shift as we speak. That said, I don't think I could say with any confidence, people smarter than me hopefully can, that there is an empirically based answer to whether or not we've got that balance between and combination between carrots and sticks down. Do you think we do?
Oh, no. Yeah. No, not at all. I don't. First off, I'm not sure we've studied the problem.
When you see it's been the answer for this for a while, and I'm not sure that cuts it, but I'd be curious what you think.
But also, I don't necessarily want to suggest that the legislative process is empirically driven. A lot of it's vibes.
Right? You're right.
And, and it gets shaped by special interests, and that's just always been the case.
Or events. We react.
Events.
We look through rear view mirrors, and we protect what we saw yesterday.
Right. So I think, I think it's inevitable, back to kind of my core point here, is I think it's inevitable that there will be more regulation on cyber. And that is, I think that's just, you can't get past the fact that we're connecting more and more aspects of life. You just heard that from Elon Musk that the first human subject has Neuralink. So whether there's net new regulation or existing regulations get mapped across, there will be more regulation, particularly I think in the connected workspace, the connected home.
That raises a huge set of questions that I don't think we can punt for too much longer, but around artificial intelligence, machine learning, where do you see them fitting into our cyber defenses in the short term, long term? And then what can we do to ensure ethically they're being used appropriately.
On the last point of what can we do, this is there was a huge there was a it was a massive executive order pushed out by the Biden administration, by the White House last year. One of the requirements was for the National Institute of Standards and Technology to issue a request for information on AI, and what support does industry need? What regulations should be out there? What does the threat landscape look like? How do we take things like the cybersecurity framework that was developed in 2013 and 14 and then map it or align it with AI risk management frameworks? And we're in the process right now of responding to that RFI. And I think there will be a good bit of information. There's no question that bad guys are using AI right now, but the good news is so are the good guys. And just unpack that a bit, what are we expecting to see out of the bad guys, right? There's no question that right now they're using it for cleaning up phishing lures, building a better mousetrap, right? So they can overcome some of the historical tells of a phishing email where there's bad syntax, bad grammar, spelling mistakes, or using the British style of spelling, with S's instead of Z's or whatever. So you're seeing better phishing lures from criminals, for instance. And I've seen this, we've seen this in SentinelOne incident response where, it's a really well-crafted phishing email. But then when you get in the real-time communications with the bad guys, it's a mess. They're back to, English as a third language and, some Eastern European, affect. That's where they are right now. But they're also going to be using it for malware development, code vulnerability detection. I think, the kind of nightmare fuel of AI from a cyber perspective is where you have intelligent malware, intelligent implant. This is where it's going to be that much more important for the defenders to have the same speed. You can't have an analyst that's watching and triaging alerts as they come across the console. You're going to have something that's automated in orchestrating the response so that when that initial penetration comes in, that the AI driven, whether it's an extended detection and response capability or whatever, sees it and stops it cold, stops it dead in its tracks, and it's enabled. It's authorized to work that response in an automated manner. And then you have a human in the loop that can go in and dig in and say, what's going on here? And you can say, hey, whoa, there's something much, much bigger going on here. But that's kind of the speed of the head-to-head. And is it going to be, battlefield victories left and right? No, I think they're going to be little incremental wins that you pick and you pile up. And then
it's like anything else. Adversarial AI, I mean, it is a cat and mouse set of issues, isn't it?
Yeah. And get on the good guys.
The difference is the good guys got to be right all the time. That's the difference. And I know I'm clichéing that a little bit, but the reality is it's like a fishing expedition. If you send 1 billion emails and only 2 people click, that's not a bad day. It costs you nothing, and you got 2 suckers.
So there was a CISO that I'll withhold names here to protect not the guilty, but it was right in, I guess it was about January of 21, and we're having a conversation about how things were going out there, what the threat landscape looked like. Ransomware was back, full speed, and I said, so how are you doing? Are you what's your ransomware threat profile look like? And this CISO said, oh, well, in January, I had about 60 ransomware events, and I almost had a heart attack. But she said, no, this is a good thing, right? Because those ransomware events were constrained or contained to a single machine.
Oh.
So the machine took the hit, but it didn't spread. And they were able to immediately detect it, flatten the box, do their investigation, and build it back up and either replace it or get it back into service. And that's exactly the point of where we want to be able to go. Where, to your point, you're going to make a mistake.
Yep.
In all likelihood, at some point on handing over creds, or you didn't patch the latest Avanti vulnerability or whatever, but you want to be able to jump on it, detect it as soon as possible, get into the response mode, and limit the ability to move laterally, and have a bad day turn into a worse day. A bad day is manageable.
Mm-hmm.
You can deal with that, and that's where
really bad
you need these detection capabilities, and that's where a lot of the investments we're seeing right now. It really does start with a core modern infrastructure where you're running the latest and greatest, but that's just on the IT side, and then you pile on top of that the right detection tools and the ability to initiate response and make sure you know what's going on.
Are dwell times shrinking?
Dwell time, it seems, is getting compressed
when we have awareness.
Right.
Yeah.
But there's still going to be plenty of times, I think, where the bad guys, if they can sit inside a network undetected, they'll use that as long as they want. And it depends on the actor too, right? The Russian SVR, who is out there on collection, and they just want to understand what's happening in the State Department or in the Treasury Department, is or a think tank or whatever. They're just sitting in a mailbox looking at the mail that's coming in. They're not trying to do anything necessarily destructive. The GRU, on the other hand, military intelligence for the Russians is likely going to try to do something destructive, right? And there's no telling how long the next, not Petya equivalent, if there is one, they would want to launch that.
But even they won't burn and compromise a method or a technique right away. So even on the GRU targeting side, it could be open for a long time.
They could, but we saw that in the initial invasion of Ukraine.
That's different. That's an active war.
But that's
a run up to conflict.
That's a model that
that
you have to keep in mind, right? Yeah. So to make the pivot, that's exactly what the FBI, what Jen at CISA, what General Nakasone, and soon to be General Hawk at Cyber Command are worried about with China. This is not theoretical that China is looking to penetrate not just our military networks, but our critical infrastructure networks here in the United States. And they are here. We have found them. So these things, to your point, this is not theoretical. We have seen this and we will see it. And why would they do this? Well, if things, push comes to shove with Taiwan, and they're going to want to undercut our ability to support and defend Taiwan. And part of that is by winning the battle before the war really begins, by undermining our support. Because if we're dealing with power outages in Atlanta and water outages in Chicago, I'm not so sure that we'll
have all the resolve there to worry about.
We're not going to be too concerned about what might be happening over.
And I don't think that is a theoretical discussion. I mean, here's the bottom line. If you can exploit, you can attack if your intent is there to do so. So, for the most part.
But again, this is not speculation, and this is doctrine.
Yep.
This is absolutely doctrine for not just China, but also Russia. There are aspects of this. And this is the best, is different as Russia and China are. There's some similarities doctrinally in how they use cyber. The GRU specifically for Russia has, two elements of information operation. There's information technical and information psychological. And part of what they want to do with the information technical is create psychosocial impacts. They want to have an event that not just manifests in disruption of a function or a capability, knocks out your ability to communicate or transact a banking account. They want the follow-on impact of panic, societal panic, chaos. The last thing I'll add here is that with China, in the latest cyber activity that's been detected, some of it's by a group that Microsoft calls Volt Typhoon, but it's part of the PLA, the Army. That there's a very clear method to the madness with the targeting of military and military support,
Guam bases.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? They're disrupting our ability to project force. There's a second prong of the campaign that's been detected that seemingly is ad hoc or may not have a rhyme or reason, and that's hitting domestic critical infrastructure. What's happening there is it's opportunistic. So they're going after vulnerable edge devices
Least resist.
to look for access to networks. They penetrate, they get persistence, and then they just quietly kind of go to sleep.
Lay low.
They wait. They wait till they need it. They'll check it every few months or whatever. They still have that access. Look, this is this thing that I think freaks most of us out the most.
And should.
Because it could be anywhere. And so how do you, to your question earlier on, what does the government need to do more to support industry, support the private sector? This is one of those where you're just like, guys, we can't tell you where they are. For one, because we can't scan every one of your networks. This thing,
For starters, we don't know.
But here's what we can tell you is that if you have maintained your networks in this fashion, not patching these edge devices, or you're maintaining these edge devices like this without keeping them up to date, and you're not regularly looking for compromise, then you're probably going to be in a bad spot. And when this thing pops off, you could be, exacerbating the issue
making
rather
a bad
than
situation
being part of the solution.
Yeah. And this is a theme I know you've double tapped over your years, and CISA writ large is resilience. I mean, right. I think we have to get to the point where we can accept we're never going to protect everything everywhere all the time from every perpetrator and every modality of attack. That's just a fool's errand.
Right.
But what we can do is minimize the consequence and impact of when an inevitable attack does occur.
Right.
I'm not sure I can say with a strong level of confidence that we're anywhere near where we hope to be. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think you're
Lifeline
right.
sectors, maybe. Electricity, financial services. And for them, it's in part because not just being good neighbors and doing the right thing for the country, but it's also in their best interest to do that, understandably.
I was at a dinner the other night, and you would have loved it because it hit a bunch of the things that you and I have talked about for years. And one of the threads I pulled on was it's still shocking to me at this point in time, given the amount of data we have, given the insights we have, given the experiences we have, and given the compute we have, that we don't more fully understand how the U.S. economy works from an interdependencies. And
we had a great discussion with Tom around continuity of the economy and the like, but you're right.
And so that's in part what we were trying to do with the National Risk Management Center, is really get to the fundamental building blocks of the U.S. economy. COVID really exposed the fragility of our economy and the fragility of our supply chains, because we there's both these varied and massive sources of inputs to supply chain, but there are also key choke points and aggregation points. And when a car can't ship off the line because it's missing one widget,
exactly,
that's still bottled up in Harvard
health therapeutics or things that are real world that we're struggling with,
and that's a challenge. And I think there's an opportunity here for government to take this problem set seriously, model it, and look for some additional resilience building measures that they can provide. Now, look, individual organizations are already doing some of this. They're they're adopting
in their own best interest, which is good.
Well,
but
in their own best interest tends to be economically driven. It's not I don't think they're necessarily driven by national security arguments. It's hey, look, I can relocate this part of my supply chain from China into Mexico. I can keep it within about a 20% margin, and then I alleviate the problems of continued trans-Pacific, oceanic shipping. And I'm inside the trade zone, the duty-free trade zone. And by the way, the Chinese have also noticed that, so they're building facilities in Monterrey, Mexico, and they get the made in North America or whatever label, so they get access to markets and certain duty-frees. But it's that sort of, how do we harness that and communicate to industry and make a more convincing, compelling national security resilience argument? And that's, I think, where we've struggled from the executive branch, from Congress, and from the broader kind of national security community.
And that's a very fair point. But the idea of aggregated data, so, I mean, a lot of these are companies I'd never heard of in the healthcare sector, for example. Or I'll give you a 9/11 example, clearinghouses. We hadn't thought about how much impact that would have. That was a potential single point failure that could have taken months for the economy.
Somebody at the Department of Treasury knew the importance of DTCC. But whether they were influential enough, and but look, what did DTCC do in the meantime? They relocated or had diverse, redundant operations in Florida and were able to
in New Jersey and elsewhere,
and be able to protect against that. But again,
it took a horrific day, is all that I'm saying. No one would have put that on the top 5.
But then we get to the point of all this stuff's it costs money. Right?
No,
and so who's going to pay for that? And I think there have to be some elements of, and this is in part what we were trying to accomplish with the National Critical Functions list, which shifted away from, is this sector more important or that sector? It was like, it's not the sectors, it's the functions they provide into the economy that matter more. So with the bank, I might not actually care too much about the ATM networks. There's plenty of cash in the system available to consumers. What's more important, though, is wholesale payments clearing on a regular basis. So how do we target those, ensure that we have the right risk understanding around it, that we're supporting it with alert and warning from the intelligence community? And by the way, the intelligence community, frankly, doesn't understand how the U.S. economy works because they're not focused here. They're focused over there. So how can we help them when they're doing collection and they come across some trove of information that the Russians have or some criminals have, that they know what it means, they don't overlook it because, they don't understand because the Russian market may work differently. So again, I think there's a knowledge gap that we need to bring together between the private sector, economists, and the government. And if we can fuse that the right way, this gets to the point of we'll have that better understanding of how the economy works.
Which gets to a bigger set of questions, and I think we're all finally at this point, but you can't divorce cyber from geopolitics, from the economy, from flashpoints that are popping around the world. How do you divorce cyber from Russia, and how do you do Russia without understanding their cyber capabilities in China and Iran and North Korea and you name the actors? I think we are finally at the point that cyber is a means to an end. It's an important means, and it could be the means, and it is its own target, but ultimately it's a means to an end. And I think we're finally getting at least the alphabet soup of our government around that issue. What's missing in my eyes, though, is lashing that up where it's not a sense of hubris that government has all the secrets. The reality is the private sector's driving this.
Private sector probably has more data on this that's relevant.
Data and innovation.
And insights and understanding. So your point about kind of the collision of geopolitics and cybers is a good place to start. And look, business risk and geopolitics is not new, but I think it's been maybe more constrained to certain sectors. So historically, right, the oil and gas companies that are operating in Africa or South America, whatever, they've always been on top of the geopolitical game, and they've got their control risks or whomever that's advising them. But now, given the shortening of distances between geographic points due to the internet, the fact that you can reach out and touch somebody on the other side of the planet like that, the implications of geopolitics.
Immediate implications, yeah.
And so to your kind of using a recent case study, Russian invasion of Ukraine, that I felt the intelligence community did an excellent job of sending signals out and declassifying intelligence to not just let the American people and our allies,
the Ukrainians themselves,
but the Ukrainians, but also Putin directly. I mean, a lot of that
that was signaling.
Was that those were deterrence efforts. So if those that were taking notice, starting in about November of 21, you could do something with that information, right? You could say, hey, okay, what's my exposure here? Well, I've got a software development team in Kiev. I've got a manufacturing facility in St. Petersburg. What do I do? How do I manage my risk here? I'm not sure there's a company out there that had a withdrawal from an entire geography playbook on their shelf that they could go, okay, you do this, you do this, you do this. So a lot of companies overnight were walking away from some percentage of their annual revenue and shutting down operations, whether turning it over to the indigenous management team or just scuttling it entirely. So I saw a lot of companies really wake up during that moment. Okay, politics and business risk are now one and the same, and cyber and IT operations is an element of that. And so there was a lot of kind of reflections like, okay, this was harder than we thought it was going to be. What's next? And the immediate reaction was kind of looking over there and be like, China and Taiwan.
Yep, that's what I was going to ask. Let's unpack that. In addition to what U.S. companies need to be thinking, what is President Xi? How is he interpreting Russian aggression in Ukraine?
I guess I'll more than anything kind of recap what I've heard is that there was I think a bit of surprise that the U.S. was able to marshal this unified Western front against Russia, be able to get expand NATO in the meantime, provide weaponry and systems into and equipment into Ukraine. I think that was unexpected. I think Putin was probably surprised himself.
Quite honestly, I was surprised. Even though there was many years of preparation to get to that point, it's very different than
actually doing it and moving and getting F-16s ready to go. But at the same time, they're watching and right now and saying, is this all falling apart? Is this, okay, maybe they don't have the resolve that we thought they did or they thought they did, and all you have to do is wait them out for 2 years. So do they have, do the Chinese have that steel to be able to maintain an invasion for whatever they've determined?
And they do have a long view on pretty much everything.
And I think that, if an invasion of Taiwan actually entails American soldiers, troops, including some that, may not come home, then I do think that our set of options, both for and against, are radically different. And then when you also have the economic impacts,
huge,
where you have to assume that any conflict is going to entail a blockade,
huge,
a slowdown or shutdown of supply chains, to the point where whether it's
chips,
Walmart,
semiconductors,
or Bergdorf's in New York,
Yep.
right? You're going to have things that are disrupted, and every aspect of the American people will feel that impact, and it will very likely be a not a short-term thing, but a longer-term thing. So what do I think? Am I certain that there is going to be an invasion of Taiwan by the Chinese? No, I'm not certain of that. I don't know anybody that frankly is. I know that there are options, and that President Xi has directed his military leadership to at least be prepared by 2027. That's at least according to the deputy director of the CIA and others. And that's about optionality, right? And that's what every leader should expect. So we've got to be prepared as a government, as a military, to be able to meet them or beat them to that deadline, whether they do it or not. But I think the key takeaway for American businesses and industry leaders is not are they or aren't they, but it's the fact that there's a lot of bad stuff that can happen short of invasion. They may never invade. The Chinese may never invade Taiwan, but that doesn't mean that they're just going to sit there. I mean, we can only look back at the last 18 months and how much more aggressive they've gotten, even with the seeming recent thaw, sending a massive delegation to Davos to, wine and dine and sweet talk everyone, sending President Xi to San Francisco to meet with business leaders. That's the outlier lately of a more hospitable business environment. But if you have business operations, and whether it's sales, you see China as a market, or whether it's you have manufacturing in China, you have to kind of run through the gamut of potential outcomes, and that ends with conflict. But in the meantime, it is, what does a increasingly hostile regulatory environment look like? What does raiding offices look like? What does theft of intellectual property look like? What does forced disclosure of vulnerability information? I mean, there's an entire industry in China that's been propped up by the government. There are laws that require disclosure of vulnerabilities identified in software in China reported to the government before to the vendor. Why? So they can exploit it. So the MSS, and if you go look at, Mandiant has their M-Trends report from last year that shows an uptick of zero-day exploits over the last year. Again, there's this entire ecosystem that's grown up that's giving the Chinese security services the advantage. See, so as a business, you have to be thinking about through what your exposure is.
And you think they are thinking that? I mean, right now, how would we prioritize to get semiconductors in terms of manufacturing?
So that's a different. So again, like separating.
It's an economic question, national security question, and how many CEOs are asking those questions?
Yeah. So the banks are always the first movers, right? I mean, the banks have been segmenting off IT operations in China for close to a decade, and this is what's commonly, at least in the consulting space, now known as China for China. So what you do is you go in, if you have operations in China, they're setting up, segmenting off their Chinese operations, where if you're sitting in Kansas City or Minneapolis or wherever, and you have a colleague that sits in Shanghai or Beijing, it looks as if they're entirely different company. You don't see them. They're not in the Active Directory, right? They're not in the global account list. So there's an approach you can take to minimize your impact, that there's no ability to move laterally within the environment. There's no ability to access sensitive information. You talked about crown jewels and intellectual property, separate systems. And that's just the start, right? So other large automotive companies in the U.S., they'll do things like, for R&D purposes, they'll do internal combustion engine research and development in China, but they won't do electric vehicles. They won't do fuel cell research or advanced material research. They may do it in Japan, but they won't do it in China because they know the risk of losing that IP.
Granted, this is oversimplification, but if you were to rack and stack the threat environment, China top a list, at least existentially. That doesn't mean everyone doesn't have the wherewithal to cause a really bad day, but in terms of existential long-term, China, Russia, countries that may lack the capabilities of those two but make up for it with intent, Iran, North Korea, very different. They're mostly in organized crime.
But look, they've been successful enough in that to build up or finance an entire nuclear weapons program.
But then you've got the proxies of all of these entities, which are very different. I mean, if we could shut down safe havens in Russia and China, I think you would see a massive drop in former Soviet Union, which I hate using that term because I never saw them as part of the former Soviet Union, but Eastern Europe and elsewhere. That would shut down today maybe 2/3.
I think that's right from an intelligence community perspective, that ranking and racking and stacking. I think from the general business community, your list of threat actors you're worried about, it begins and almost ends with cyber criminals.
Yep. And they're in it for the money.
And
it's
here's
as simple as that.
This is something I've said before, and it always gets me funny looks sometimes when I talk to government people. But the government, I think the intelligence community has a fetish for state actors, which is natural. I get it.
It's what they're there.
And so what happens is that's what national security experts from government then go out and talk about to industry.
10-4. Yeah.
Which instead we should be talking about your biggest threat, the thing you're getting hit by every day.
Ransomware.
Is ransomware.
Yeah,
I don't care who you are. You could be a mom and pop shop. You have a ransomware problem. Yep. You very likely do not have a China problem unless you're selling a key widget for the F-35 or a submarine. Like, that's the thinking that I think we have to shift on. But there are some chips. You mentioned chips, right? I think Intel might be the single most important company in the United States of America for the investments they're doing in chips. And if you play in that game, you're right there next to them. Microsoft, one of the most targeted companies in the entire world, right? Because 90% of the U.S. government runs on Microsoft Productivity Suite.
Yep.
O365, M365, whatever. Like, that's how some companies have to think. And if you're in the Fortune 100, you have to be thinking, like, I am heavily targeted by a state actor. And this is the shift that is incrementally happening. This concept, and Jen Easterly wrote a whole foreign affairs piece on it, but this concept of corporate responsibility in cybersecurity. If you have been successful enough in the economy to become systemically important, you need to think beyond just what shareholder responsibility looks like and what your fiduciary responsibilities there, but also what do you owe to the broader economy and nation.
That's a great point. And I'm glad you brought up mom and pop shops, because at the end of the day, small and medium-sized business, that is the backbone of our economy. That is our innovation. That is, to a large extent, the success of our country. And
I mean, every one of these large companies now started in a garage somewhere.
That too, absolutely. And when you think about it, the gap between what we're seeing, some of the Fortune systemically important critical infrastructure areas, which I know we're not using those terms, but lifeline sectors, whatever terminology we want to use, and small and that deficit's growing bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And when I look at what CISA can do to help support, whether it's state and local, as they have, you used the elections ISAC as a model to genuinely build trust with SLTT, state, local, tribal, territorial, and small and medium-sized business. That, to me, is where you can get the greatest, to lack of a better term, bang for our buck right now. And that's not happening as quickly as I'd like to see. Everyone gets it, But then how do you touch this community because it's so diffuse and dispersed?
I think what we have to keep in mind is that there's not just some CISO sitting on the bench in that county in Missouri,
and they all look
just waiting for somebody to drop a tool in their lap.
If they have a CISO at all.
And that's kind of the point, right? There's a intake gap that we don't fully appreciate. We can go say, hey, use this tool. And a CISO is just trying to make sure that, or a CIO rather, or an IT director is just trying to make sure that the computer that's 8 years old is running and it's been defragged, right? I mean, that's kind of where we are in some situations.
Chris, on a positive note, what suggestions would you have for a young woman or young man in pursuing computer science, or maybe not even computer science?
Right. Yeah, I think if the area I am the most optimistic about in digital risk management is the workforce. Because every day somebody's coming into the workforce that's tech native, that's been working with the systems that you and I work with now. They've been using them every day for almost their entire lives. And my Alex Stamos, who works with me, and he's a professor at another university out
a great
on the West
university.
Coast. But he teaches a cybersecurity course and then a trust and safety course. But one of the things is he actually a requirement for one of his finals last spring was they had to use a generative AI capability, whether it was Hugging Face or something else, in completing their final project. And so we've got, he had college students that were fine-tuning models to go execute whatever the task was. And, just thinking about that is incredible. This is what, we all see as cutting edge.
Requirement.
It's cutting edge technology that's now, it's just part of the day-to-day curriculum, I guess, in colleges and universities. So substantial opportunities for new entrants into the workforce if you have an open mind on technology. If you take that understanding that that technology is going to drive everything around us for the rest of our lifetimes. And that's why I've got so much kind of,
confidence.
It's confidence that we're relevant, that these conversations are relevant, not just today, but 5 years from now. And that's, one of the rhetorical devices I use when I give talks is that close your eyes and imagine 5 years from now, how connected your vehicle is going to be. How many connected devices in your home, on your body? Now what cutting edge is like an Aura ring. What's it gonna look like in 5 years? There's more and more. To your point, I mean, I'm a policy guy, but I came out of law school. I never practiced a day, passed the bar, and was like, I'm just going to go do government stuff and policy stuff. So there are a thousand different avenues into a career in cybersecurity and technology risk management. I listening the other day, Harry Coker, the national cyber director, the second confirmed national cyber director, was talking about his, about the plans to remove some of the degree requirements for jobs in cyber in the federal workforce. Kind of stop the overspecking of positions. So I think there's great opportunity down there. Just take an interest, and you don't have to have a cybersecurity degree or a master's, but show some interest and get in. Whatever, if they're internships or other volunteer programs in the IT department at your university, get some practical experience, but then just play around with stuff at home.
Curiosity is key, and it reminds me, often it's how technology is applied and used that makes the big difference. We've had technologies for years, and if they're applied in a new way, it can have huge societal impact. So, Chris, what questions didn't I ask that I should have?
in the China hearing the other day, General Nakasone, as he's riding off into the sunset, made the comment that 2024 election is going to be the most secure to date election. And then I've, famously been attributed to saying that the 2020 election was the most secure in history, which is actually a group of election officials that made that statement that I amplified. I still stand by it. But the 24 election, I think, is going to be it's going to be a bumpy ride. I think it's going to be pretty spicy because as I think about the geopolitical chaos that's happening out there, that the number of actors that have a set of motivations that have shifted, we'll say, over the last couple of years, and that's Russia invading Ukraine, that's Iran in the middle of a pretty hot Middle East right now, that's China's. That's China looking at Taiwan, even though
contrary to promises.
President Xi says that he will not interfere. But
different environment, but trust but verify.
I'll take that to the bank. Right. Yeah. I think it's going to be pretty active, and it's not going to take a lot just because it's a supercharged environment. But I do think that we have a number of advantages built into the American election systems. It's not one, it's many. If you've seen one state's election system, you've seen one state. Yep. So I think that continues to work to our advantage. And, I ask this question of the intelligence community frequently, but, is there anything changed? Have you seen anything? And they continue to this day, so they have no evidence or seen that an adversary has a capability to interfere with the vote casting process, to change a vote, to interfere with the counting process or the certification process. So I've got a lot of confidence. I think everyone else should. And, I think much like in 20 and much like in just about everything else right now, let's take a deep breath and, hold on to your chairs. But I think we'll get through this one.
And let the women and men tasked with the big jobs do their jobs. Chris, thank you for your service. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for continuing to be such an important voice in the cyber community, and appreciate it. So thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks,
Thank you,
Auburn,
Chris,
for having me.
Thank you.